hello people of the internet. This is Don from Explosions Incorporated. I've decided to try my hand at this vlogging thing that all the kids are a fan of these days because it seems to be, I don't know, the way to get information across, specifically hard to understand information sometimes. And if there's one thing Aaron and I both pride ourselves on, it is our ability to communicate difficult and sometimes complex scientific topics in a really accessible way. Now, there's a lot to science that isn't just big bangs and booms. Believe me, we both wish that wasn't the case. If we could make the case for every single field of science just by blowing things up, our lives would be a lot easier and a lot more fun. But there's a lot of science out there that's just not amenable to being shown on stage. And so I thought I'd attempt to make some of that not really theatrical science accessible. So today, let's talk about something that's near and dear to all of our hearts and very close to all of our minds right now. Let's talk about Ebola. Now, I know Ebola is causing a bit of a stir worldwide. It certainly is here in the United States where Aaron and I live because there's an epidemic right now in Western Africa. Now, Ebola is a horrible, terrible disease. It's nasty, its symptoms are nasty. Even if you make it through, you're going to suffer the entire time you have it. But what I'm going to tell you today is you don't really need to be afraid of Ebola at all if you are living in a developed nation. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the United States because that's where Aaron and I live, that's where we're from, and that's where you've got that case in Texas recently. Unfortunately, that patient died on the 8th of October, a couple of days prior to the recording of this video. But still, even if you live in Texas, you shouldn't be worried about Ebola. Now, why is that? Well, quite simply put, it's because you're not going to get it. Now, I know this is a little bit counterintuitive. People have been told that Ebola is this horribly infectious disease. And that's true. But infectivity is not the only measure of how likely you are to catch that disease. You also have to worry about the contagiousness of that disease, how long that disease is contagious for, etc. and so forth. And here's the thing about Ebola. It's just not very contagious. You have to be exposed to the infected bodily fluids, so blood or saliva or gross things that I don't want to say the names of because maybe children are watching. Those different bodily fluids don't just have to touch you. They can get on your skin or somebody can sneeze on your shirt. You can take it off. You probably won't get infected. You've got to get some of those infected bodily fluids containing viral particles inside your mouth or in an open wound or an eyeball or a mucous membrane or something like that. You have to have direct contact with infected bodily fluids from somebody who is currently symptomatic for Ebola. That's right. During the 1 week period when they're symptomatic, that's the only time they're actually contagious. Now, contrast this with many other diseases when the contagious period extends into, and in some cases, it's exclusively during the period when the disease is in incubation. It's incubation period, like chickenpox, for example. Before we had a chickenpox vaccine, kids would get chickenpox from other kids at school who didn't even know they had it because the pox hadn't erupted yet. Once they actually dry out and you look like you're all symptomatic for the chickenpox, it's not really contagious anymore. Now, the scary thing about Ebola is that if you get exposed, it has a very, very high infectivity rate. So low rate of contagion, because you have to be directly exposed to those bodily fluids and whatnot, a very high rate of infectivity. That means it takes a very small number of viral particles for that disease to actually take root in your system and infect you. But that's mitigated by the fact that it's not very contagious. So think of it this way, okay? We are at SeaWorld and we go to see the Shamu show. Okay, now for everybody who saw Blackfish, just bear with me here because this didn't actually happen. It's just an analogy. And you've got the big auditorium with the pool where the dolphins and the killer whales are and Shamu and everything. And most of us are sitting in the back row, but then there are some people up front in the splash zone, okay? In this analogy, the water in the pool is Ebola. Now, we are all within easy sight of all of this nasty Ebola just churning all around in that pool. But only the people in the first 3 rows are in the splash zone. Those are the only people who are actually subject to the contagiousness of the disease. But every single one of those people is gonna get wet. Are you with me here? Even though we're really close to Ebola, only a few people are prone to catching it. But every single one of those people, pretty much, is gonna actually catch it. Now, you put all of these statistics together, all of these numbers, how infectious is it, how contagious is it, how long is it contagious for, you get what's called the R0, or the basic reproduction number. That's the average number of people in a given outbreak that are going to be infected by one already infected person. The R0 for Ebola is about 2 people. Every person that gets Ebola will, on average, this is across outbreaks through history, infect 2 other people. Now, you have to bear in mind that this average is heavily weighted in favor of outbreaks in developing nations in Africa, where they don't have proper medical aseptic technique until somebody from the World Health Organization or a developed nation sends some doctors over there, ready access to clean water, where their hygiene may not be up to par because without clean water, there are pathogens running through the environment on a constant basis. And still, the basic reproductive number is 2 people. Now, the death rate for Ebola, also pretty scary. You hear a lot about it in the news. It's about 50% on average. But again, that 50% is weighted by all of those really heavy death tolls in the developing nations in Africa. Now, the one guy who caught it here in the States, he died the other day, like I said a minute ago. So right now we have a 100% death rate, 100% fatality rate for Ebola in the United States. That's not really that big a deal. And I mean that in kind of the grand scale of things. Of course, one person dies, that's terrible. But on a statistical level, 100% death rate because one person caught it and one person died just is not important. And for anybody who's having trouble following all this talk of averages and weights and whatever, I will talk more about averages and their usefulness and lack of usefulness in certain contexts in a future video. But for right now, just take my word for it. When your numbers are heavily weighted in favor of a place where lots of people are dying of this disease and lots of people are getting this disease, and that R0 is still only at 2 people, you don't really have anything to worry about. Now, compare this with measles. The R0, the basic reproductive rate for measles, is almost 20 people. For every one person that gets measles, almost 18 are going to get measles from that person. Measles is a really contagious, horrible, suffering, deadly disease, and it's been on the rise over the last 10 years in almost every developed nation in the world. There have been measles outbreaks in major cities and larger towns and communities all across the United States of America, and the amount of fear and concern that we're seeing over the resurgence of a disease that was historically horrific and almost eradicated by the end of the last century pales in comparison to some of the worry that I have seen over Ebola, a disease that one person has caught in the States and that one person has died from, and that the CDC is, by all accounts, doing an excellent job of taking care of. Now, there's this interesting phenomenon I've noticed where people tend to get really extra freaked out over the scary, unlikely things like Ebola. Almost, it seems, precisely because they're unlikely, because we don't see them every day, because we're not used to hearing about them. Here's the thing. Over 40,000 people in the United States every year die in a car accident. Almost 600,000 people, about 560,000 people in the United States every year die of heart disease. And we are very familiar with both of these things. We all know somebody who's been in a car accident. Hell, we probably all know somebody who's died in a car accident. We all have friends and relatives who have had heart attacks. But we don't freak out over car accidents and heart disease. We keep driving, we keep eating incredibly foods that make us unhealthy and even more prone to heart disease. And I think it's partially because we're so familiar with them. They happen all the time, even though they kill vastly more people. So I guess what I'm saying is, just doing some quick back-of-the-envelope calculations, you're probably actually more likely to die in a car accident because you had a heart attack while driving than you are to die of Ebola. But nobody really worries about that. I think we probably ought to be more worried about those things that don't scare us. If something deadly happens so often, so regularly, that we become inured to it, that we're used to it, that it's not scary anymore, those are the things we really ought to be scared of. Not unlikely things like airplane crashes or lightning strikes or shark attacks or, for that matter, Ebola. It's awful and it's nasty and it's killing lots of people in Western Africa right now. But if you live in the United States, you don't really have anything to worry about.